Hi, welcome to the show. Today I'm going to take you behind the scenes of one of the most interesting trips I've taken this year. I had the opportunity to join fellow Arkansas legislators in Washington, D.C. for meetings with officials from the White House. They called it the State Leadership Conference. We met with officials from the Intergovernmental Affairs, Department of Energy, FBI, and a whole bunch of others. But the purpose wasn't politics. It wasn't about campaign events. It was about helping state legislators understand where the federal government is headed and where Arkansas fits in those plans, and most importantly, how we can take advantage of opportunities while protecting our own state's interest. I'm going to walk you through some of the big takeaways on energy, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. So let's talk about it. I will say that one of the best parts of being a state legislator is having the opportunity to bring information back home. Sometimes the biggest value isn't passing a bill, but it's seeing what's coming before everybody else does. And I think that's what this trip was able to do. The first meeting a few of us had was with the Department of Energy. I expected we'd spend more time talking about generation of energy, but in reality, we spent most of the meeting talking about how energy is truly a national security issue. One thing that many people don't realize is just how important nuclear energy is to America. Nuclear power has safely operated in the United States for more than 65 years, and it provides more than 20% of our nation's electricity. Here in Arkansas Nuclear One generates about 25% of all the electricity that's produced in Arkansas. That's an incredible contribution from one facility. And one of the benefits is that it is on operation about 90 to 90% of the time. Arkansas enjoys some of the lowest electricity prices in the country, thanks in part to Nuclear One. As electricity demand grows from manufacturing, AI, and data centers, having that reliable, affordable baseload power becomes more and more important. So we talked about what we can do with Nuclear One. And one of the issues that we have is nuclear waste. So we talked about the whole cycle of nuclear fuel. And so that means going from producing the fuel to dealing with the waste to storing the waste. And instead of just storing spent fuel rods, one of the things that researchers have been looking at for a long time is how do we recycle those? Because there's so much usable material still in those fuel rods that we can recover and use again. Officials mentioned, and I thought this was fascinating, that there are more than 100 casks filled with spent fuel, and that if we could recycle that spent fuel, it could provide 10 years or more of additional energy and technology. It's pretty cool. So what's preventing that from happening? Largely federal policy, regulations, and economics. So we're working on that. So instead of seeing that spent fuel as strictly waste, we're trying to find ways to make it a future resource. And that represents a major shift in thinking. There'll still be waste to deal with, but much, much less waste that we have to worry about storing. One of the other things we talked about with the DOE was the Highland Industrial Park in South Arkansas. And if you're not familiar with this, it's an amazing area. Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics are both producing components down there that support America's missile defense system, including the Tomahawk missiles. It creates components for the Iron Dome and potentially for the Golden Dome, which would be America's defense system. Federal officials see this facility becoming more and more important as America expands and as we get into next generation nuclear technologies like SMRs or small modular reactors, which would be small nuclear reactors that are able to provide energy in a very, very safe way. So this is not just good for Arkansas, it's good for America's national security, and it's a tremendous opportunity for Arkansas. Arkansas isn't just participating in America's energy future, we are helping to build it. So from there, we went on to go to the White House, and we met with a bunch of different officials. The first group that we met with was the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, which sounds like a lot of bureaucracy. But the real purpose of it is pretty straightforward. They are a bridge between Washington and the state governments. And so whether it's talking to governors or legislators, even tribal governments and local officials, their job is to make sure that communication is flowing in both ways. And I thought it was good to hear that even state legislators and states are a priority as they're looking at implementing federal priorities. Too often, it seems like Washington develops policies without understanding what actually is going to happen back home. And so I feel like these conversations were closing the gap on that. One of the first big speakers that we got to hear from, and I thought is one of the most fascinating briefings, came from the FBI Deputy Director, Andrew Bailey. And as a side note, he actually served in the Missouri legislature before he worked his way up and then joined the Bureau. His message was pretty straightforward. The threats facing America today look very different than they did 5 years ago. Cybercrime, artificial intelligence, foreign influence, online fraud, even online organized criminal networks. These threats continue to evolve, and so must we. One of the specific things he talked about was the violent online crime, the crime networks that target young people. These predators increasingly use gaming platforms like Roblox, as well as social media to target these kids. And we as parents and as good citizens need to be paying attention to this. One of the other things that he said was that artificial intelligence is making scams dramatically more convincing. Criminals can now clone voices. Kids call asking for help from their parents when in reality it's just a cloned voice. They make videos that seem very realistic and phishing emails that are almost impossible to distinguish. But one of the things I appreciated about him was that he talked about the FBI wasn't just talking about problems. They were talking about building partnerships with local officials. Here in Arkansas, there was a project, Hail Caesar, where local officials worked with FBI, and they actually took down a transnational predatory group in Northeast Arkansas. We're fortunate to have people like our Attorney General, Tim Griffin, who makes cybersecurity a priority. The FBI is working very closely with all state legislatures. And I think it's important that we continue to fight, where there's the governor, the legislature, the attorney general, and our law enforcement, that we all partner together and educate consumers fighting cybercrime and keeping Arkansans safe. From there, we got a briefing from the National Cyber Director, which sounds like it could be the same thing, but it's totally different. So Sean Carencross is the National Cyber Director, and his presentation centered really on scale. Where the FBI focused on the individuals and taking down rings that are targeting people one-on-one, the Office of National Cyber is actually talking about these large cyber criminal groups that can launch an attack against thousands of millions at one time. And, whether that is looking at taking ransomware, or they're holding records hostage, or if it's just attacking and stealing money on a large scale, these are the things that he's working on. And they talk about cybercrime not just domestically, but actually operating multinational companies, which is crazy when you think about the abilities that they will have at that point. So cybersecurity requires constant vigilance. It's strong systems, good habits, and cooperation. And from our local officials, but also from our local governments, to make sure that we are giving access, but not giving up personal rights at the same time. Artificial intelligence is making and is going to continue to make amazing things possible. But unfortunately, it's giving criminals access to new tools. And so all of us need to adapt and be vigilant. And I think that's one of the things that he targeted. Okay, so my next speaker, and I'm not going to go through all the speakers we have, but for our next speaker, if I'm honest, when the executive director of federal permitting walked into the podium, I was not expecting it to be one of my favorite presentations. But it turned out that it was certainly one of the most practical. Emily's team was focused on one goal: getting projects from paperwork to groundbreaking much faster. So instead of spending years bouncing around agencies, they're building systems that coordinate approvals and dramatically reduce days. And it's great news as we look at building roads, bridges, energy projects, like I mentioned before, and even manufacturing projects. And all of that also means jobs. When they talked about it, they said under the Biden administration, in the 4 years that Biden was president, only 17 projects made it through their approval system. So far, in the 2 years that we've had under President Trump, 24 projects have been completed and another 65 are in process in over 34 states. That's a pretty significant jump. They are focusing on a 14-day turnaround to get projects approved to be into the system. And then they have a 60-day window to connect those projects with potential agencies to look at the opportunities. It's incredibly fast. Wouldn't it be great if our local governments were able to do approvals that fast on the projects that we have before them? So economic development really doesn't happen just because somebody cuts a ribbon. It's removing those unnecessary barriers to projects so things can actually get built. And for a growing state like Arkansas, that is welcome news. So as I flew home, I realized this trip, it wasn't about Washington. It was all about Arkansas. It was about making sure that our state is prepared for what's happening next. So whether that's energy, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, infrastructure. Our job isn't simply to respond to change. Our job is to help Arkansas lead it. And so I came away optimistic. Here in Arkansas, we have affordable energy, and we need to keep it. We're investing in advancing manufacturing and growing jobs, and we're positioned for nuclear innovation. We continue to grow economically, and our partnership with federal agencies can help us to keep moving forward. The best part of serving in the legislature isn't about passing bills. It's bringing those ideas, partnerships, and opportunities back home to Arkansas and making sure that our state is ready for tomorrow. So thanks for joining me today on the show. I'll look forward to catching up with you next week.